The conflict between Israel and Iran escalates as Israel targets Iranian nuclear sites, citing an existential threat. Questions arise about U.S. involvement, the state of Iran's nuclear program, and potential consequences. The situation remains tense, with concerns over regional stability and the implications of military actions on civilian safety. What are the implications of U.S. involvement in the conflict? How close is Iran to developing a nuclear weapon? What are the risks of radiation from targeted nuclear sites? The ongoing conflict between Israel and Iran is escalating, with Israel feeling pressured to act against Iran's nuclear ambitions. This tension raises questions about potential U.S. involvement and its implications. Israel believes it faces an existential threat from Iran, fearing that a nuclear-armed Iran would seek to destroy the state of Israel. This perspective isn't universally shared in the region or by international observers. Donald Trump's potential decision to support Israel in this conflict reflects the divided opinions within his political base regarding military involvement. In the Middle East, some urge caution while others advocate for a strong stance against Iran. The Fordo nuclear enrichment facility in Iran is a critical target due to its deep underground location. Israel would require U.S. support to effectively strike such fortified sites. Iran's uranium enrichment has reached 60%. Nearing the critical weapons-grade level of 90%, raising international concerns regarding potential military implications. The strategic importance of this development cannot be understated, especially in light of military capabilities. The GBU-57, a massive bomb used for penetrating fortified structures, is crucial for potential military actions against Iran's nuclear facilities. Its deployment highlights gaps in Israel's military capabilities. Iran's supreme leader holds significant authority over military decisions and diplomatic negotiations related to the nuclear program, influencing the country's strategic direction. This leadership structure complicates the situation. Public opinion in Iran is divided, with widespread protests indicating significant dissent against the regime. This internal strife could affect the regime's stability and its nuclear ambitions. The armed forces in Iran support the current regime, while the youth are increasingly seeking change. This highlights a growing divide between the regime and the aspirations of the younger generation. Benjamin Netanyahu has consistently warned about Iran's nuclear capabilities over the years, suggesting they could develop a weapon in a very short time frame. This concern reflects ongoing tensions in the region. The JCPOA, established in 2015, aimed to limit Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanction relief. However, the U.S. withdrawal from the agreement in 2018 led to increased tensions and compliance issues. The International Atomic Energy Agency recently reported that Iran breached non-proliferation obligations, raising international concerns. This violation does not confirm imminent nuclear weapon production, but it heightens scrutiny. The complexity of U.S. military operations in the Middle East is affected by Iran's proxy forces and missile arsenal. The potential assassination of Iran's supreme leader could significantly destabilize the region. The logistical importance of Kuwait and Bahrain in U.S. operations highlights the strategic military presence in the Middle East. These locations serve as essential hubs for military coordination. Iran's proxy forces, including Hamas and Hezbollah, face challenges in coordination due to recent military actions against them. The depletion of their resources impacts their effectiveness. Israel's multi-layered defense system, including the Iron Dome, faces vulnerabilities against Iran's missile capabilities. The introduction of hypersonic missiles presents a new level of threat. The situation in Iran is dire, with civilians struggling to find safe evacuation routes amidst widespread airstrikes. Despite government efforts to provide shelter, the density of the population complicates evacuations significantly. Traffic congestion has intensified in Tehran as civilians attempt to flee to perceived safer areas, but airstrikes complicate their escape. The situation highlights the chaos and danger faced by residents. China and Russia have been criticized for their lack of substantial support to Iran, despite existing agreements and the exchange of military supplies. This raises questions about the reliability of international alliances. Israel's nuclear capabilities remain unconfirmed, leading to speculation about their military strategy and its implications for regional security. The ambiguity surrounding Israel's nuclear status contributes to tensions. Israel possesses advanced missile capabilities with the Jericho-3 missile, which has a range of about 6,000 kilometers. Despite speculation, Israel has not formally acknowledged any nuclear weapons program. The question of why Israel is perceived as allowed to possess nuclear weapons while Iran is not revolves around threat assessments made by international bodies like the U.S. These assessments focus on intent and capability. The potential for an arms race in the Middle East exists if Iran develops nuclear capabilities, prompting neighboring countries like Saudi Arabia to follow suit. This could destabilize the region significantly. There is uncertainty about a natural successor if the current Iranian regime falls, as past protests have shown a lack of unified opposition. Various factions exist with differing goals and visions. For the country's future, the potential for chaos in the Middle East is heightened by fears of Iran's retaliation if the U.S. intervenes in the ongoing crisis. Concerns also include risks associated with nuclear facilities and regional oil supply. The historical context of the Iraq conflict raises concerns about possible regime change and ensuing chaos, similar to what might happen in the current situation. Minimal radiation leakage reported by the IAEA alleviates some fears regarding nuclear sites, which are typically protected due to their underground locations. Iran's potential responses to U.S. involvement could include disrupting oil supplies and targeting desalination plants, escalating tensions significantly in the region.
It is day 6 of the conflict between Israel and Iran. Donald Trump is reported to be considering joining Israel in targeting Iran's nuclear sites. Tehran has warned Washington today of irreparable damage if the US does that. It is a crisis that is escalating by the day. Now, you have sent us a huge number of questions, and here with me to answer as many of them as we can, I have the BBC security correspondent Frank Gardner, and also with us is Mikey Kay, a former senior officer in the British military, who now presents the BBC's Security Brief. And Nafisa Konavad from BBC Persian is with us from Beirut. Thanks all of you for joining us here. Let's get straight to it. Frank, to you first of all, the first question from George. Why has Israel bombed Iran now?
So Israel's position on this, George, is they're saying that they had no choice, that in the last few months they believe Iran was accelerating towards building a nuclear weapon, that the talks, the negotiations in Muscat and Rome between US and Iranian negotiators about a deal to curb Iran's program were going nowhere, that Iran was stringing the US along, and that therefore this was the last resort, that they see an existential threat from Iran towards Israel, that if Iran acquired a nuclear weapon, it would use it because it has previously vowed to destroy the state of Israel. That is not a view shared by the rest of the region, and it's not necessarily shared by the International Atomic Energy Agency, that's the UN nuclear watchdog, nor indeed is it shared by the last open source report we have seen from US intelligence, which did not say that Iran was about to produce a nuclear weapon.
I'll come back to that point because it's a very important point in a moment or two. But another really important question, it is one of the most searched questions, and it is America going to join the war against Iran?
Right. Can you see inside Donald Trump's head? Because I can't. It's down to him, frankly. He held a 90-minute session of his National Security Council. He was closeted in inside the White House yesterday with his security chiefs and getting advice on both sides. And there are domestic considerations from here because Donald Trump came to power on the back of something called the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again. And there are those within that movement who say, whoa, don't let's get involved in another Middle East war. Please, Mr. President, we didn't vote you into power to get us bogged down in another Middle Eastern war. There are others who are saying, Israel's fight is our fight. If we don't stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, we will one day end up regretting it. So he seems to be split. Now, the reason why the US is so important in this is that Israel does not have the ordnance, the bombs to penetrate deep enough underground in somewhere like Fordow, where there is a secret or semi-secret enrichment facility. And for that, it would need America's B-2 with their something called the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. But there would be major considerations and blowback for the US and its Gulf Arab allies if it got into this war.
Well, Frank, you set up the next question beautifully, because a lot of questions, a lot of searches, and Mikey, I'm going to bring you in on this about that Fordo site, because it is one of the sites we've heard a lot about in the last 6 days. Where is Fordo and what is it, is being asked?
Fordo is about 200 kilometres south of Tehran. It's one of 2 critical enrichment facilities that Iran has. And it's very much, and I think we've got some imagery and some maps here. It's very much been built in a mountainous region, and the reason for that obviously is protection. And it basically is one of the key enrichment facilities that Iran have been using to get uranium-235, which is the isotope, up to 60%. Now, 60% is a key figure because the IAEA report in May basically stated that enrichment purity was up to 60%. 90% is the key weapons grade metric, so they're not quite there, but it's not a big jump between 60 and 90. And you can see on the screen here, it's a very mountainous area. Fordo has been struck by the IDF already. However, it's believed that the airstrikes were going after surface-to-air missile systems and air defense capability around it in order to make it more vulnerable.
Tell me more, because Frank talked about it, because the whole conversation around American involvement revolves around these bunker buster bombs. So tell us about that sort of munitions that has been talked about and why they are considered so vital here.
Yeah, Frank alluded to it, the massive ordnance penetrator. The official name for it is the GBU-57. It can contain a 13,600 kilogram warhead, or about 30,000 pounds. It's basically, Matthew, a massive, massive bomb. The IDF doesn't have anything like this. The only way that this particular weapon can be delivered is through the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. They're around $2 billion a unit, an aircraft. So if I was looking at the question on how does the US get involved, as a former strategic military planner, you'd be looking at where the gaps in IDF capability is. The IDF don't have any gaps in targeting ballistic missile sites, surface-to-air missile systems, or strategic leadership, but it does have a huge gap in being able to penetrate something like Fordo. Now, it's not a foregone conclusion that the GBU-57 could actually destroy the Fordo plant. It's more likely to degrade it, and it would be more likely to have multiple airstrikes using the GB-57 in order to do that.
Let me bring Nafisa in from Beirut, and a whole range of questions, but some of them are really simple in what they're trying to find out. And I've got a couple here, and they want to start by knowing who is Iran's leader, first of all.
Well, Iran's supreme leader, he is the head of the state. He is the religious figure, but he has a lot of power, much bigger than what a president, the country's president, can have. He is considered as the commander and chief of staff of armed forces, and he is a decision maker for major decisions that should be made in the country, including negotiations with the US. He is the one that he would give green light to diplomats and foreign ministry that they can go ahead and speak with the US over a nuclear program.
Another question that follows on from that: how much support is there for this regime?
Well, people are divided, but and I haven't been in Iran for 15 years now. We can't go there, but what we gather that division is going deeper and deeper. Iran has witnessed massive protest only 2 years ago against the regime. It was a mass protest, it was widespread, and people were, especially youths and women, participated in that protest, asking their rights, the freedom and social freedom mainly, and also some wanted the end of this regime. But we cannot ignore that this regime still has its own roots and its own supporters. How the percentage is not really clear, but the issue is that the armed forces, majority of armed forces are connected to the regime, and they are still supporting that regime because they receive their power from the regime. But people inside, right now, I think the youths, they want new life, so
yes.
that can tell you that probably the majority of youths don't want this regime.
Frank, I've got a question from Rosina, who asks how close is Iran to having a nuclear weapon? But before you actually answer that, I just want to take viewers through a few of what Benjamin Netanyahu has said over the years, because last week on the 12th of June he said if not stopped, Iran could have a nuclear weapon in a very short time, within a year or maybe a few months. That's what he said last week. In 2018, he said Iran has the wherewithal to do it very quickly. In 2015, he said they are weeks away from having an entire arsenal of nuclear bombs. In 2012, he said they're close, 6 months away from having enough enriched uranium to have an atomic bomb. In 2006, Iran is gearing up to having 25 atomic bombs a year. In 1996, Netanyahu told US lawmakers, ladies and gentlemen, time is running out. And in 1995, he said Iran is capable of creating nuclear bombs between 3 and 5 years. So that arches over nearly 3 decades. So, Frank, what is the answer to that question? How close is Iran?
OK, so first of all, I think let's just get this out on the table. Iran says they have no military, their intentions are entirely peaceful, that their nuclear program is for civil use, for power generation. Israel clearly doesn't believe them. Some of their actions have aroused suspicion, not just in Israel, but also countries like the UK and others. But you're absolutely right to list that. You know, there is an accusation here that Israel, or at least Benjamin Netanyahu, has been crying wolf with this. Now, there was a deal, let's not forget, something called the JCPOA. This was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It was the crowning glory of President Obama's foreign policy, and it was concluded in 2015, also called the Vienna Nuclear Deal, which, in return for the partial lifting of sanctions on Iran, it put in place some very strict inspections by UN nuclear inspectors inside Iran, and Donald Trump pulled the US out of it. Iran waited a year and then said, OK, you know what? If they're not going to take part, then nor are we. So they broke a lot of the protocols. Now, very importantly, about a week ago, the IAEA, that's the UN's nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, pronounced that Iran was in breach of its non-proliferation obligations. That is not the same as saying they are about to produce a nuclear weapon.
Mikey, let me bring you back in, and a lot of questions still to get through. So in terms of answers, let's try and keep them condensed. A really quick one here from Asher, who says, will the US's entry, if they enter this conflict, not provoke Iran to strike US targets?
Yeah, Asher, there's certainly risk. ISS risk is capability versus intent and probability versus consequence. And it's a graduated and proportionate risk assessment on whether that will happen. The consequences for the US are fairly significant. There are about 40 to 50,000 US troops based in 19 locations across the Middle East. You've got Far West, Royal Air Force Akatu, which is on the southern tip of Cyprus. There are US personnel based there. You've got what's called the CAOC, the Combined Air Operations Center. That's effectively providing the military picture across all of the Middle East for all of the US operations. You've got a US naval facility in Bahrain. Kuwait is the main logistics hub for all US operations. So there is a significant amount of risk there, but it all depends on how the US decide and to what extent the US decide to get involved. And I think that would probably start with something like the B-2 stealth bomber.
Nafisa, let's go back to you in Beirut, because we've heard over days now a number of times the possibility that's being mooted of taking out the supreme leader, assassinating him. If that was to happen, what are the likely consequences?
The consequences, it will be a big blow for the regime, of course, for the government of Iran. They will lose their head and he will be killed by another country, which will be humiliating. But there are replacements for him. although in recent years, because of the demand of reform inside, there have been speculation, and also there have been discussion over that this system doesn't work, and maybe there shouldn't be any replacement for Iran's second supreme leader, which is Mr. Khamenei, after Mr. Khomeini, who was the leader of the revolution, actually.
Frank, let me bring you back in because, of course, there's been a long lead up to what we've seen over the last 6 days. A question here from Craig, who says, how coordinated are Iran's proxy forces? Can they, in effect, be a second front?
I don't think any longer, no. I mean, the Quds Force, that's part of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. This is their job, coordinating those. But since the October the 7th Hamas-led raid into Gaza in 2023, Israel has systematically taken down a lot of this kind of first line of defense that Iran had. They have depleted Hamas in Gaza. They have largely depleted Hezbollah's arsenal in Lebanon. Syria is no longer an ally of Iran because Bashar al-Assad has been deposed, not by Israel, but by jihadists. And the Houthis are relatively constrained in Yemen. So they're not very well coordinated, no.
Mikey, as a result of some of the things that Frank has been talking about that we've seen over the last few months, a question here from Craig, who says, is Iran's missile arsenal capable of overwhelming things like Israel's Iron Dome? Because we know that Iran very depleted in those Israeli strikes last year.
Yeah, I think the three-tier layered defence system that Israel has is absolutely vulnerable. We know that after the October strikes by overwhelming ballistic missile attacks from Iran, actually the Israeli Defence Force had to restock their silos. And I think we've got a graphic here of the three-tier layered system. If we can just take a quick look at that, I'll take the viewers through it very, very quickly. On the outer defence, you've got two missiles called Arrow 2 and Arrow 3. Their range goes out to about 2,400 kilometres, and that's the first line of defence, if you like. That's what the IDF will be hoping will take out the majority of the ballistic missile threat from Iran. The inner bit is called David Sling. That goes out to about 300 kilometres. And then from about 4 to 70 kilometres, you have what's called the Iron Dome as we know it. That's the Tamir missile system. It's got 3 to 4 launchers per battery, 20 missiles per launcher, so that's 60 to 80. But they can be overwhelmed quite quickly. One of the big things about all of this is Iran has what's called a Fatah 2 hypersonic missile. That has what's called a hypersonic glide vehicle. That means the warhead, when it separates from the main rocket itself, at Mach 5, which is 5 times the speed of sound, that can actually maneuver. They can maneuver that. And so that's going to be really, really difficult and provide problems for that three-tiered layered defense system to be able to counter. And the whole system itself has around an 85 to 90% success rate. So 10% will get through. And with these hypersonic missiles, that's probably going to attrit that even more.
Nafisa, let me bring you back in with a question from Matt, because, of course, we've heard President Trump urge people in Tehran to evacuate the capital. So Matt asks, where are civilians in Iran able to go?
Nowhere. President Trump talked about Tehran, which IDF, Israeli army, also released some warning for different sectors and different neighborhoods in Tehran, asking people to evacuate. But these neighborhoods on its own, they are accommodating tens of thousands of people in dense area. And recently there have been footage coming out from Iran showing that there have been traffic jamming all around Tehran while people trying to go towards the northern part of the country, which they consider safe. But then there have been airstrikes on those areas as well. Because right now the targets are so widespread by Israel, no area can be considered safe. Although in Tehran itself, the government announced that they are opening the metro stations 24 hours. People can take shelter there, and also mosques and schools can accommodate those that have to leave. They have to leave their neighborhoods. But in general, we are only for Tehran, we are talking about the city that it has more than 10 million on the main part of the city. So you can imagine that evacuating those people and fleeing from in this situation is not really possible for many.
Yes. A question from Jalal, and I'll put it to you, Frank, who says, why hasn't China or Russia offered any substantial assistance to Iran?
Yeah, good question. I mean, if I was in the Iranian regime, I'd be pretty miffed, I think, at the lack of support they're getting from Russia. Remember that Iran and Russia, they signed an agreement, a kind of mutual self-help pact, or a mutual help pact. Iran has supplied a lot of Shahed drones to Russia to use against the Ukrainians. It's also sent them over 100 ballistic missiles across the Caspian Sea. What have they got in return? Not very much. And Russia is clearly trying to stay out of this. They've offered themselves as a mediator, but they are an ally of Iran, of course. China doesn't depend, but imports a lot of Iranian oil and has stayed largely out of this. Now, it's possible that China could become an intermediary here. They were able to patch up an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran to put that together, and the handshake was done in China. So there is a mediation role for China, but so far it's very clear that Israel and Iran haven't finished this fight yet.
Mikey, a lot of focus over the last few days on Iran's push or otherwise to a nuclear bomb, but does Israel have nuclear weapons? Because it is always thought they did, but they've never confirmed that, have they? So what have they got, Israel?
The real answer is we don't know. Israel has not confirmed or denied the presence of a nuclear capability. It's not part of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But if we look at, I think it's important here, if we look at what does it take to have a nuclear weapon, it's three major components. The first one is enriched uranium up to 90%. The second one is the ability to build a warhead. And the third one is the ability to deliver that warhead onto a target. We know that Israel has the Jericho 2 and the Jericho 3 missiles. The Jericho 2 has been phased out in 2026. The Jericho 3 will take the main basis of the ballistic missile capability. That's got a range out to about 6,000 kilometers. So Tehran is well within targeting distance of that. But as it stands, there is no overt declaration by Israel on any form of nuclear capability. The big question I would ask is, going back to that, what do you require? The enriched part, which needs to get up to 90%. My big questions would be, are Israel producing that organically, or is that coming from somewhere else like the United States? We don't know.
Just a quick follow-up, Mikey, because Rosina has sent in another question on the back of this, saying, why is Israel allowed nuclear weapons but Iran not?
And that's what the big question is. I think the answer would be from the US or from the IDF. It's all about threat. Going back to that probability versus consequence and capability versus intent. And I think in measuring that threat from Iran, when you're looking at, what is the risk of them having a nuclear capability, intent may be one thing, but capability is definitely other. And as Frank was talking to earlier, the peaceful part of enriching uranium to give it a energy supply, for example, that's about 3 to 5%. So when the IEA come out with a report saying that they've got enriched uranium up to 60%, the big question is going to be, well, why have you got that? And what are you planning on doing with that in terms of that risk assessment? People might look at Israel and go, well, even if they did have nuclear weapons, and the estimate is they've got about 90 nuclear warheads, the risk would be significantly less, this is in my opinion, of them using any form of capability, because obviously that would involve many conversations with the US administration as well. So, but it's a fantastic point you raise, is, why should one have and why should the other not? But Saudi Arabia have come out, MBS has come out, he's spoken about the potential of a nuclear capability with Iran, and there's also the very real possibility that if Iran is allowed to develop that, then it would start some form of nuclear arms race inside the Middle East, and Saudi would pursue a similar sort of nuclear capability itself.
Let's go back to Beirut, because I've got a question here from Rich. And Nafisa, I'll answer Rich's question, because we've had so much talk in the last few days swirling around about regime change. And the question from Rich is, if the current regime is overturned in Iran, is there a natural replacement?
No, that's a question that the answer to it is not really clear for many Iranians as well. The previous protests a couple of years ago showed that there is no united opposition in a way that they agree on major points and be able to work with each other and replace this government. Right now, there are different options, including the son of Iran's previous king, who is now living abroad and recently was interviewed by the BBC itself. He has supporters inside and outside, but how many supporters we can't really say because he has opponents as well, including inside reformists and those that are against the regime. They don't want to go back to or bring back someone that he is only the son of the king that was overthrown almost 40 years ago by people themselves. So it is not really clear that there will be a vacuum after the regime. If the regime falls, there will be definitely a vacuum. This is what we know for now. And there is no one replacement for this regime.
I've got a minute and a half left on the entire programme. A twin final thought to you, Frank, because of course people will be reminded of the Iraq conflict, not knowing what happens after if there was regime change and the chaos for 2 decades. And I suppose that parallel stands here potentially. Also, a lot of people worried about the risks of radiation if nuclear sites and facilities are constantly being hit.
So far, it doesn't seem to be too bad. The IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, report only minimal radiation leakage. Remember that a lot of these facilities are buried deep underground. So that hasn't been a major worry so far. I think what's worrying the region is that if the US joins in, Iran could lash out at not just US bases up and down the region, they could potentially sow mines in the Strait of Hormuz, choke off part of the world's oil supply and hit desalination plants. There's a lot more that Iran could do in retaliation, which is kind of what the Supreme Leader was referring to this morning in his televised address.
Frank, we are out of time. Thank you, though, for your time. Well, that is it from Your Voice, your BBC News. Thanks to Frank. Thanks to Nafisa.